In this video, I'm going to show you how to use both the buoyancy system and the fluid simulation system together to make a log that floats and generates dynamic ripples. Let's dive right in. In our last two videos, I showed how to make objects that float on water and how to use the fluid simulation system, but I just barely touched the surface on both of these two really exciting and complex systems. Today we're going to take a deeper dive into both water buoyancy and using the fluid simulation system. Let's start out with water buoyancy. So 2 weeks ago, I talked about the topic of buoyancy. And what we did is we took this BP Buoyancy example blueprint that's in the water content folder. If your water content folder isn't visible, come over here to view options and turn on show plugin content and show engine content. That'll make this folder show up. It's available starting in Unreal Engine 4.26. So if we come onto water content and then water blueprints, you can see that there's this BP Buoyancy example. And if I drag and drop that into our scene, I'm just going to raise it up a little bit. And then with our play button here, I'm going to drop this down and pick simulate. And that's going to drop our cube into the scene. And you can see that it's moving along with the river now. The river's not quite deep enough for our cube to float all the way, but you can see it's kind of meandering along with the flow of the water in our river, which is pretty cool. And in our previous video, what we did is we took this buoyancy cube and we came over here to the options and we selected the static mesh, and instead of using the editor cube, we just used our log mesh here. Well, today, instead of just replacing our log mesh on the instance, we're actually going to create a copy of this buoyancy example here and add our log that way. So I'm going to right click on BP Buoyancy example. And I'm going to pick duplicate. And you can see that I've done this once before because I've got my BP Buoyancy log here. So I'm going to call this one BP Buoyancy log 2. And we're just going to run through all the steps of how to set this up. So I'm going to double click on BP Buoyancy log 2. And here is our blueprint. The first thing that we want to do is, again, select our static mesh. And instead of editor cube, we're going to select our log. And this is the log that we downloaded a while ago from the Quixel Mega Scans bridge. And it's just called RDKeg. There we go. RDKeg log 1, log 1. And we're going to select this mesh. Really, you can use any mesh that you want, but this one is a nice size for what we're working on. And I'll link it in the description down below in the Quixel Bridge app so you can grab this log if you want to. Okay, so if we switch over to our viewport here, you can see that we've got our log mesh. And if we select buoyancy, which is what we're shooting for here, and we come over here to the buoyancy section, you can see that we have these objects called pontoons. Before we do any editing, let's take a look at the result of what we've done so far. I'm just going to delete this BP Buoyancy example from our scene. And we're going to go ahead and add our BP Buoyancy log 2 to our scene and raise it up just a little. If we intersect it with the water, it'll just sink right to the bottom. So we have to raise it up just a little bit so that when we simulate the scene, it'll land on the water's surface. So here we go. And you can see that our log is kind of bobbing up and down on the surface and not doing exactly what we want it to. So what we need to do is fix it up. So let's come into our BP Buoyancy log 2 here. And you can see that we have these objects called pontoons. And there are 4 of these pontoons set up in our array. And what pontoons are is they're floatable elements. And right now these are set up to work correctly for the cube. So if we open these up, you can see that they have a relative location. This one is at -50x, -50y, and 0z. And if we take a look at the positions of all of these, what you'll be able to tell is that they're kind of arranged on the four corners of the cube so that our example cube could float. Well, that was great for the cube, but it doesn't really apply to our log. And so I'm just going to hit the trash bucket icon here and get rid of all those pontoons. I'm going to add 2, and these are the ones that we need for the log. But how do we know where these positions are? Well, I can come up here under Add Component. Unfortunately, there's no good way to visualize these components. It would be nice if they added some kind of visual element in the UI here that we could move around, but we can't. And so we're going to do the next best thing, which is to come up here under Add Component and just add a temporary child actor. And that's going to show up in our scene like this. And we can move this child actor around and then just take the location of that and copy and paste it to our pontoon. So it's not too bad of a workflow. I'm just going to use 2 pontoons in this case. I'm going to put one down here on this end of the log. And I just want to make sure that it's kind of in the right location. I want to put it in the center of the log there on this end. Then I'm going to raise it up to a Z value of 35. Actually, you know what? I'm going to put it in the center for now, and I'll show you what that looks like. And then we'll switch over and move it a little bit higher in a minute. So I'm just going to right click on location here and pick copy. Then I'm going to come back to Buoyancy. And for pontoon number 1, I'm going to right click on relative location and pick paste. And you can see that position value from our child actor is now the location of pontoon number 0. All right, so let's select our child actor again. And I'm going to move it down to this end of the log. And you can see our log is not exactly lined up on our x-axis here. It's just slightly diagonal, which is kind of interesting. But I'm just going to figure out the right location for this pontoon. Kind of line it up on the z-axis as well. And then I'll copy this location. Switch back to Buoyancy. And paste it into the correct location for my second pontoon. All right, so I've got both of those placed. And I'll hit save here. Let's switch back to our scene. And I'm going to hit play to simulate. And you can see that our log is kind of rolling around and kind of jiggling up and down. There are 2 things that we need to do in order to fix this. First of all, I want to raise the pontoons up, like I was saying before. I'm going to set the Z value of both pontoons to 35 so that they're slightly off center. And this is going to make the log rest a little bit lower in the water. If I take a look at our child actor here and I set it to 35, you can see that it's no longer centered. That's going to push the log down into the water and make it float kind of heavy. So I'm going to save that. We'll switch back to our scene and hit play and take a look at what we get. All right, that sort of did what we were looking for, but you can see that our log is still kind of jiggling up and down and floating right on the surface of the water. Let's switch back to our log and see if we can figure out what's going on there. So if I pick this static mesh and I scroll down here to physics, you can see that simulate physics is checked on. And that's really important because we do want the log to respond to gravity. But we can also see that this mass in kilograms box is checked on. And what this is doing is it allows us to override the mass of our log. And in this case, the override value is set to 50. Well, if I uncheck this mass in kilograms box, what it's going to do is allow Unreal to look at the size of my object and figure out what the mass really should be based on its volume. And you can see that when I turn this off, Unreal set the mass in kilograms to 192, and that's significantly higher. So now that that's off, we're going to get a much more realistic weight for our log. So let's go ahead and save our log here and switch back to our scene and go ahead and hit play. And we'll run over here to our log, and you can see that the log is now sitting a lot deeper in the water, and it's also significantly harder for me to push around. So now that our value is being calculated by Unreal and it's finding a more realistic weight for our log, we're ending up with more realistic behavior. So pretty cool. We went a little bit deeper into buoyancy, and we learned about the pontoon elements, and we also learned about setting the mass for our log to get correct behavior. I'm liking this a lot more. Well, let's go ahead now and talk about dynamic ripples. So in last week's video, I showed you how to add this BP Fluid Sim 01, a blueprint to your scene. If you haven't seen that video, go ahead and watch it because it shows the basics of setting up fluid simulation. Today I'm going to show you how to add water ripples to this log that we've created, BP Buoyancy Log 2. So I'm going to switch over to BP Buoyancy Log 2 and make sure we have that open. And then I'm also going to come here under Water Content and Fluid Simulation Blueprints Examples. And here we have an object called BP Dynamic Force Component. I'm going to go ahead and drag that into the scene. This is something that I showed you last week as well. But if I come here and I turn on our simulation, and as I move it up and down and it intersects the water, you can see how it's making these little ripples. Well, this is the effect that we want. I want to be able to take what this thing is doing and add this effect to our log. So let's go ahead and do that. If I open up my BP Dynamic Force component, I can see that there are all of these graph nodes. And I'm not really an expert at using the blueprint graph system, but I am pretty good at copying and pasting. So I'm going to show you how to do that today. So here we have the input node called event tick. And I'm going to go ahead and select all of these nodes that are connected to event tick and copy them. Then I'm going to switch back to BP Buoyancy Log and go to the event graph. And here's my event tick box here. And if I paste here, then I can connect my event tick where it is in the other graph. And now I have my event tick part of the graph hooked up. I'm going to come back here to my BP Dynamic Force component again. And here I've got a bit of graph that's connected to event begin play. So if I grab all of these nodes, copy them, and come back in here and paste them, now I can hook this up. My event begin play, I can hook that up here to the delay, just like it is here. It's hooked up to the delay. And now I've got this graph, just like it is in the example. The other thing that I need is this force mesh. So I'm going to copy and paste the force mesh component. And I'm going to paste that in here. And then the last thing that I need is all of these components. So I have sim, radius, strength, etc. So I need to go ahead and for each of these, copy and paste them. All right, so I finished copying and pasting all of the components from the dynamic force component here to my buoyancy log. And this is going to allow my graph to function correctly. I'm going to go ahead and hit compile here. And because I copy and pasted all of the elements, the graph was able to compile correctly, which means now I've taken the dynamic properties of that dynamic force component and put them onto my log. That's pretty cool. So let's go ahead and see what happens. Switch over to our scene here, save it and hit play. And did you see that? when our log hit the water, it's generating these ripples. Actually, you know what? I think I may have been looking at the wrong log. Let's push play and look at it when it's simulating this log. Okay. Yeah, that's what I thought. So this one is actually not working. So there are a couple of things that we need to change to make it work. Okay, if I select my BP Fluid Sim 01, you can see that I have this box checked called Follow Player. And normally when you're playing your game with your player character, you want that to be on so that your fluid simulation goes around with your player. But in this case, I'm going to turn that off because I want the fluid simulation to show up in a static location, which is within the bounds of this green plane here. And so we're going to leave Follow Player turned off for now, just so that we can see the fluid simulation in the viewport. The other thing that I'm going to do is come back over here to Buoyancy Log and select our force mesh. And you can see that the location of our force mesh, this is the mesh that is going to be using its collision to collide with the water to generate those ripples. You can see that our force mesh is located at 0, 0, 0, which is our origin. And I want it to be actually in the middle of the log instead of at the bottom. We can also see that the scale of our force mesh is set to 0.03. And I'm just going to crank this up to 40 so that we can actually see this. So here's the sphere. And what this does is when this sphere collides with the water plane, that's what generates the ripple. So I'm going to line it up with my log here so that it's in a good spot. And we'll save this and then switch back to our scene. And now when we simulate our scene, we get a little bit of a ripple. Let's go ahead and play the game. In order to do that, again, I'm going to switch back here and turn Follow Player back on. And I'm going to play in the selected viewport. So now if we go to our log, it's not creating ripples, but if I bump it, maybe if I jump on it, well, I'm having a hard time getting that object to intersect with the surface of the water. When it does, when it crosses the water plane, there we go, it generated some ripples, but I'm having a hard time getting it to happen at the right moment. And there is a nice system already in place for fixing that. If I switch back here to log and I go to my event graph, you can see here that I have this part of the graph set up to do some oscillation. I have this parameter here called oscillation speed and this other parameter called oscillation magnitude. If we switch back to our scene and I take a look here, I'm going to select my log. And you can see that those parameters are exposed here, oscillation speed and oscillation magnitude. Right now they're set to 0, but let's set oscillation speed to 4 and oscillation magnitude to 40 and save that and see what happens now. So if we take a look at our sphere here, the force mesh, you can see that it's oscillating back and forth in our scene. And that's the effect that we want. We want it to oscillate, but we actually want it to oscillate up and down so that it crosses through the plane of the water. So let's go ahead and change our blueprint graph so that instead of oscillating on the x-axis, we're oscillating that force mesh on the z-axis. So I'm going to grab this guy here and wire it into Z, and then hold down Alt and click on this wire to disconnect it from the X. So now our oscillation of our force mesh is going to be happening in the up and down in the Z-axis instead. So I'll go ahead and save our log blueprint and switch back to our scene. And let's simulate this and see what we get. Okay, so now our force mesh is animating up and down, and you can see that every time it crosses the water plane, it generates one of those nice ripples, which is kind of cool. This is the effect that we're looking for. We want our log to be creating these ripples, which is great. The only problem is that force mesh is drawing in our scene, and it's a little bit distracting. So let's go ahead and turn that off. All I have to do is come over here to the force mesh component, scroll down to the rendering section and uncheck visible, and we can save that. And now that force mesh will no longer draw in our scene, but it'll still be contributing its collision to the scene so that it's generating those nice ripples for us. There we go. So it's oscillating up and down, passing through the water plane, creating those dynamic ripples. Let's go ahead and take our scene for a spin with our mannequin actor. I'll turn on follow player again and switch from simulate to play in the selected viewport. So now you can see that we have a log that's floating correctly, and we've added a nice component to our blueprint with the graph behavior that animates these nice dynamic ripples. Now you can see that our log mesh is not exactly perfect for this because it has an opening in the bottom, but maybe you can find a better mesh to use that doesn't have that cutout opening. But anyway, pretty cool. We made a log that floats, that feels like it has some weight in the water, and that generates dynamic ripples using the fluid simulation system of Unreal. I hope you enjoyed today's tutorial. Next week, I think we're going to get back to doing a little bit of landscape material editing. We're going to add the rain system that we created a long time ago with little raindrops and rain ripples and puddles and such. We're going to add that system to our terrain. So I hope you'll tune in next week to take a look at that. And in the meantime, have a great week, everybody. Thanks for watching.